underneath was a little girl who my born-again Christian father found woefully independent and thus impossible to break. After endless Bible study sessions around our dining room table and heated lectures about expectations and behavior in the car on the way home after worship, amidst numerous complaints of the unworthiness of the pastor, he desperately wanted to believe that he was grooming a decently obedient, submissive woman, a satisfactory helpmate for a male of his choosing, if the laws prevented his mother's sins to be visited upon his own children. But I proved to be a harder nut to crack than he had tactics. I used to tell people I ran faster than he did. So I was deemed for most of my life as his heathen child, doomed to be put in eternity for in hell. Moreover, though, I was covertly sustaining his primary victim, my mother. And long story short, he died alone on a street, literally heartless, a bitter, old, crazy man. When I was 12, sitting at a kitchen table, I told my mother, if God is who Dad says God is, then I don't believe in God. But if God isn't who Dad says God is, then someone should tell the world. I had no idea that one of those someones would someday be me. Leaving home after high school graduation was never in question. I always wanted to leave home. But when I did, I left the facade of a sweet smile and party dresses behind, along with all of my involvement in organized religion. After spending my freshman year of college floundering to identify myself for myself, my sophomore year was the year that I finally located my special niche in life, or at least I thought. Much to my father's dismay, I used the very gifts of creativity and a big mouth that he passed on to me to become a social activist. On the wrong side, from his perspective, and without the benefits of his rule of good girl Christian conduct and dreadfully low expectations. I had the privilege those 3 years in organizing groups of women against relationship violence, of helping a small African-American house on campus to address some racial disparity, of first connecting the very closeted, very frightened lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered community with resources related to the AIDS epidemic, and then to connect that little micro-community itself to the wider community, encouraging students who needed support to get support. Shortly before I graduated from Wittenberg University in 1986, responding to the General Synod of the United Church of Christ resolution, which was done in 1985 on openness and affirmation, I lent a hand. It was a small role, but I lent a hand to the development of the very first O&A process. One afternoon, passing through the chapel of the chapel atrium, which was the library entrance, the associate chaplain almost literally bumped into me. He knew who I was. Wasn't hard to tell. In the course of conversation that afternoon, he suggested that although I was hardly involved in chapel life on campus, and was brutally, really very hard on all the people who went there. I was most certainly, in his eyes, doing what he called Jesus work. He and I never specifically talked about Scripture, but he was my first Philip, opening up a connection between me and Jesus. By the end of my senior year, I was actually dating someone who God was calling into ministry. Tom would be my second Philip, but at the time I didn't quite understand him at all. Instead, I was a little more than a little confused. This young man didn't seem to have the same demands of me that my father did. And yet, strangely enough, he was a faithful Christian. At last, I decided that I could trust this young man, but wasn't about to get involved with his odd vocational interests. After we were married and he was in seminary, out of sheer practicality, at least that's what I told myself, I took some master-level courses just so that we would speak the same language over dinner to show an interest in his career, ironically, as a good spouse should. I strategically took those courses in a polar opposite community. Tom went to this pristine, all-white, single-denominational seminary. He was a good cradle Presbyterian in the suburbs of Atlanta. And me? I took my courses at first in a predominantly African-American interdenominational seminary in the heart of the city. That is where I think I heard my first sermon really hurting. It was there that I began to lose track of all of the Philips in my world, both those who affirmed me as a person worthy of the love of God, and those that, assuming I was worthy, engaged me and challenged me and made me put my shame and everything about my faith underneath a microscope. By the time Tom graduated from seminary, I was ready to seek out my own seminary, having reconnected with the United Church of Christ in a real way, a denomination that at its core seeks to unite people from different traditions and perspectives and experiences, simply because we believe that unity in diversity is Christ's ultimate goal. But what I don't think that many people understand about the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, about the stories of millions of us who are like him, I don't think people understand how profound the experience of inclusion is. Imagine just for a moment that you have darker skin than all the people around you, being removed from your own people and set in a culture that is foreign with ways that are strange. Imagine speaking a different language, longing to hear your own language, easing communication barriers. Imagine having a different sexuality, having your sexuality exploited, used, and condemned. Imagine being told that because your spirit's gender doesn't match your body's gender, that you are a freak and an outcast. Imagine being told because your gender doesn't match your calling from God, Strap yourself in. Imagine being told that you're a whore behind the altar. That was my father's reaction to my calling from God. Imagine what it's like for people that you love, people that you are supposed to trust, people that you look to for guidance, for support, for personal affirmation, to look at you with pity and disgust, to call you names, to avoid looking you in the eye, to avoid hugging you or shaking your hand, pulling their children and their spouses just a little closer when you're in their presence. Imagine what it is like to walk into a church and be treated like you are an abomination, needing salvation from who you are to be acceptable. Now imagine what it is like for someone, maybe even a community of someone's, to climb off their high and mighty chariot and to run towards your chariot, down the street toward your chariot, and lay open a word that infuses your world with hope and grace. Now imagine what it is like for someone to say to you, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that prevents you from being baptized, that prevents you from being included in community, named, claimed, called, loved. Just from my words, do you feel that difference in your chest? Does it bring tears to your eyes like it does mine? Imagine what it is like to hear for the very first time, absolutely nothing about you separates you from the love of God. Not the opinions of others, not their judgments, not their ugliness, not what you have done to survive in this cruel world, not your gender, not your sexual orientation, not your race, culture, language, age, none of the usual things that separate us from one another, no less separate us or threaten to be separating us from God. It's like the best non-discriminatory policy ever written, but it's better. Because instead of being created as a legal document to remind the rest of us that you can't treat people like that, it's a covenant, it's a promise that none of us will be abandoned even when time is up. This is not about tolerance. I hate to be tolerated, don't you? To be put up with. As if someone absolutely has to. It's about appreciation, affirmation, compassion, fierce resurrection love. The only reason why I can wear this robe at all is that there were a few Phillips that came into my life, opened up my calling,